Eh. Videotapes. Such good memories they give us. But today's story is not about that. Well, let's begin. Hello everyone. My name is Stepan, I am 13 years old, I live in Novosibirsk. This story happened to me in the summer. One time I was walking with friends through the courtyards of old panel houses. It's a strong vibe. There were two of my friends with me. I was going into the 6th grade. My first friend's name is Kirill. He is also 13 years old, but he was already going into the 7th grade. This weirdo is into insects and because of this he always disappeared. You invite him to go for a walk, and he goes out. My second friend's name is Roma. He is 14 years old and he was already going into the 8th grade. He is my main buddy. He is quite cheerful and funny. So, we were walking through the courtyards, chatting about school. And suddenly we went into a yard that was full of old sheds. And we wanted to go into one of the sheds, to see what was inside. Kirill chickened out. He said, "Guys, I'll wait for you, I'm scared." And Roma immediately agreed. When we went into the shed, there was an old shelf with some small box on it. It was pretty heavy. Roma and I barely managed to get it down. There were 5 video cassettes in it. I knew a little about this topic. And Roma said to me, "Let's unwind these cassettes and wrap them around each other." I answered him, "What if there is some rare film in there, or a private family recording that collectors are hunting for?" Kirill answered, "What if it's true? Let's leave them." All the cassettes were in pirated packaging and on each cassette it was written, Attempt 1, Attempt 2, Attempt 3, Attempt 4, and on the last cassette it was written, Excellent result. I suggested that the boys go to my grandparents' house. They lived in a 2-story building nearby. The boys immediately agreed and we went home. The next day I wrote to Roma, he replied, "I'll be there soon." Then I wrote to Kirill, he replied, "Sorry, I can't," crying face. So he disappeared again. And so that our group wouldn't decrease in size, I also decided to invite my friend Irina. She was already going into the 9th grade. But despite this, I really like her as a girl. I'm 13 years old, and she's 15. She replied, "Okay, I'll be there soon, 3." So we gathered near the porch of my grandparents' house. My grandfather was at work that day, so my grandmother allowed us to sit. We knocked on the door. My grandmother opened it for us. And she said, "Come in, my dears. Would you like some tea?" We refused because we were in a hurry to watch the tapes. We sat down more comfortably on Grandpa's bed and I took out the old Sharp VCR. We closed the door to the room. When I started the VCR, a small column of dust gushed out of it. Since it had been standing idle for a very long time. After that, there was a slight smell of burnt dust. Roma said, "The VCR probably burned out. Our tapes are covered." I knew that everything was fine and I calmed them down. When the VCR warmed up and started working normally, Roma and Irina calmed down. Roma hands me a tape with the following written on it, Attempt 1. I turn on the old TV. When it turned on, I heard a loud squeak and crackling. From which our ears hurt. We inserted the first tape into the VCR and pressed the play button. Judging by the date in the lower left corner, the video was recorded on May 28, 1998. In the video, a man was filming a typical Soviet apartment in an old panel Khrushchev-era building. He was simply filming a room. There was almost no sound. And I had to turn it up to maximum. Then I heard the words of another man. Then the man who was filming began to walk into some room very quietly. And suddenly he began to film another man from around the corner of the room. That man was talking on the phone. He looked about 25 to 30 years old. He had a fairly athletic build. In his words, you could hear. Pauline, please. Pauline. Come on, Paulia. After that, the recording ends. It lasted about 6 minutes. The tape ended. Roma, Irina, and I did not understand what was going on at all. Roma hands me the second tape. I also insert it into the VCR and press play. Judging by the date at the bottom, the video was made on May 29, 1998. The video is being filmed by the same man who was talking on the phone. He is walking down a city street and you can hardly hear anything. But then I hear that he seems to be quietly crying. His crying grew louder with each passing minute. It seemed to me that he was mumbling something like, "Fields, Fields, how are you? I'll find Fields, I'll find Fields." We were a little scared. Towards the end of the video, the man was walking down the street and just went into hysterics. He was screaming and crying with an inhuman cry. I had to turn the volume down to minimum. He was crying so desperately that we even felt a little sorry for him. And when he let out a heart-rending, piercing scream, the recording ended and the tape ended. We sat in a little fear and bewilderment. And Roma, with a shaking hand, hands me the third tape. Video date, May 31, 1998. In it, we see the same man, who is also walking down the street, but no longer hysterical. And we notice that he has a tattoo of an inverted Orthodox cross on his hand. This scared us a little. Then he raised the camera a little higher, and we notice a small 2-story building. And Roma tells us, "I know this place. It's a gym. I used to work out there. My dad." We are shocked. We watch on. And suddenly the recording breaks off, and the next piece of film begins. It showed this man in the sports hall. His friend is filming him. How he pulls himself up on the horizontal bar and counts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. The man was quite strong. He was able to pull himself up 36 times. After that, the cameraman says to him, "Motya, you are 26 years old, and you work like a machine." As we understood, the man's name was Matvey. And he says to him, "Vlas, and you are 29 years old, and you can't do pull-ups at all." The cameraman's male friend was called Vlas. He starts filming how Matvey goes to the biceps machine. After that, the security guard of the gym comes up to Matvey and says, "Young man, amateur filming is prohibited here." After that, something strange happens. Matvey takes a wad of 50 ruble bills out of his pocket and, supposedly, slips them into the guard's hand. He leaves. After that, all the horror begins. Matvey starts throwing himself at Vlas, screaming and saying, "Why did you film like this? Scum." After that, the recording ends. My friends and I are sitting in complete shock. Roma, shaking with fear, hands me the fourth cassette. Video date, June 9, 1998. In the video, a camera is filming from afar, motionless, from the bushes. Filming location, a cemetery in some village. Roma says, "I know this cemetery. My grandfather is buried there. He died in 2010 after being shot in the heart." The video showed a funeral of some person. The recording was almost motionless. Very long and tedious. It lasted 2 hours. We rewound the tape to shorten the time. The shooting time is 2200 hours on June 9, 1998. When everyone had left the grave after the funeral, the camera came out of the bushes and Matvey appeared. He started walking towards the buried grave. When he approached, we were all in a state of wild horror. There was a name on the monument, Ipatov Vlas Sergeyevich, born March 19, 1969. Died of a concussion. To put it mildly, we were simply F***ked. The shooting ends. We realized that Matvey was a murderer. The next frame shows the same grave. The date is the same, only the time is already 22:30. The grave is doused with some kind of black liquid. I don't know, either it's visible on the camera, or it's urine, or water, or something worse. And suddenly, for a second in the frame, we hear the striking of a match and the shooting ends again. In the next frame, we see shooting from afar in the dark. The grave is burning with a bright, huge flame. The entire cemetery is illuminated by the light from the fire. The grave was burning for 5 minutes. And when the 5 minutes had passed, it was complete horror. The grave simply flew into the air from a powerful explosion. The roar was very loud. On the lens damaged by the fire, we see human flesh, limbs and just a bunch of meat flying apart. The filming ends again. After that, Roma, Irina and I felt sick. Our faces became pale and in a cold sweat. We sat rooted to the spot. In the next frames, we see the date, 10:30 June 10, 1998. The killer Matvey is filming the cemetery blown apart by the explosion. After that, he comes to the place of Vlasa's grave and there are charred human limbs, organs and dried blood scattered everywhere. And the killer says, "Vlasic, Vlasic, now this is what you look like." Oh my God! What a horror it was! The naturalism of the shooting was at its best. Roma couldn't take it anymore and threw up right on the floor. Then Irina threw up, and then me. We spent about 30 minutes cleaning the vomit off the floor, and then aired out the apartment so that Grandma wouldn't suspect anything. We took a sedative and continued watching. The following frames show the date, June 12, 1998, 1:30 a.m. The killer Matvey walks through the courtyards of old Khrushchev-era buildings and approaches the entrance to one of the houses. He takes out something like a nail and breaks the intercom. He enters the entrance and goes up to the 6th floor, as we understood. The shooting was very dark. The weak flashlight on the camera didn't help. And suddenly the man approaches one of the doors and films the door for 2 minutes. The door number is 61. Then he takes out some kind of homemade wire pick and starts to very quietly pick the door lock. He tries to pick the door for 5 minutes. Then the first click of the lock happens, and then the second. The killer quietly opens the door and rents the apartment standing from the entrance. Nothing is visible. The painted wooden floor is barely visible. Then something terrible happens. The light suddenly turns on in one of the rooms and an elderly woman appears from around the corner. She looks about 60. And this freak takes out a gun and shoots the old woman, and that's where the recording ends along with the tape. I take it out. It was very long. We decided to take a little break from what was happening and have some tea. After the break, when we calmed down a bit, we started watching the last, 5th tape, which says, "Excellent result." The date of the video is June 12, 1998, time 3:30 a.m. Nothing is visible on the video. But when the killer approached the camera and turned on the flashlight, I realized that this was an old brick basement of some barn. And suddenly the killer films a girl who looks about 15 years old and she is handcuffed with one hand to the wall. She is wearing a sweater and panties. She has nothing else on. This degenerate puts the camera on something and unfastens the girl from the wall. He is dressed in a military uniform. He tears the tape off her mouth and she screams shrilly and loudly. He covers her mouth with his hand and says, "Shut up, bitch, or it will be worse." He takes the camera in his hands, takes off the girl's panties. I tell Irina to cover her eyes with her palms, because I knew what was about to happen. This faggot pulls down his panties and begins. I think everyone has already guessed what he started doing. He shoved the girl for about 30 minutes. Sounds characteristic of this business were heard. And suddenly this dog whispers, "You're 14, and it's already going so deep." After that, he leads the girl to the exit from the basement, and then he gets up himself. He spanked her 3 times, she cried. Then he said, "You will now live with me, my dream has come true." Polinka Polinka, it would have been better if you had agreed right away. This is where the last tape ends. We were incredibly happy about it. We were hungry, stressed, exhausted. Roma, Irina, and I ate some sandwiches and tea. We took another sedative and went to bed. We went to sleep right on my grandfather's bed. We simply didn't have the strength to go home. Before going to bed, we all hugged each other so that it wouldn't be so scary. And I hugged Irina. I already said that I really like her, and that's why when we hugged, we were too close to each other, which is why I got an erection. I don't think she noticed it. I miraculously managed to hide my boner. But Roma noticed it, and he told me about it a little later. We slept soundly. Very soundly. So soundly that we almost slept through the alarm for 7 a.m. My grandfather was supposed to be home from work at 8 a.m. So there was no time to waste. We cleaned up the room and started getting ready. I said goodbye to Roma on the porch of the house. We shook hands firmly and he left. And I walked Irina home. And since I like her, I tried to touch Irinka, for which I got a slap on the hand and she laughed loudly. We hugged and went home. I went home. I slept for another 4 hours. Woke up at 12 and went for a walk. I invited Roma and Kirill to go with me. They both agreed. When we were walking with Roma and Kirill, Kirill asked, "What was on those tapes?" I answered, lied, "Yes, some old action movie from episodes. It has no value." When I returned home, I found a video cassette in my mailbox, which horrified me. It said, "A happy ending." I invited Roma and Irina to watch this tape. I prepared a VCR at my house. When they arrived, I started to insert the tape into the VCR. And suddenly, Irina shouted loudly, "No!" and threw the tape out of my hands. She threw it on the floor and its protective cover flew off. I took a screwdriver from my grandfather and fixed the tape. When I turned on the VCR with the tape, the date was August 28, 1998, time 14:30. In the video, we see the killer Matvey going to the local grocery store, buying butter and sour cream. He films everything along the way. When he came home, the filming was interrupted. In the next frame, we see that same girl Paulina, who is sitting on the couch in that same sweater and smiling. She was clean, washed and well-groomed. And the strangest thing is that she was happy. Then Matvey appears in the frame. He puts the girl on the couch, sits on her and takes off her socks. He takes melted butter with sour cream and scoops some into his hand. Just a little bit. He spreads it on her heels. And then he starts tickling her heels and feet, biting them, and she laughed loudly. All this lasted for about 30 minutes. Roma felt a little disgusted by this. I looked at him in bewilderment, and Irina was embarrassed and chewed. The tape ended. I gathered all 6 tapes into a pile and hid them in my basement under my apartment in a 2-story building. But at least the last tape didn't have any murders or cruel sights. Roma, Irina and I said goodbye to each other at home. And now, when we all walk together, we remember it with laughter and sometimes with horror.